I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. At Newswise, we host a monthly webinar series, and this month's webinar is titled, Are You Talking to Me? Today, we're bringing together science communication researchers and professionals to share the latest research on communicating science more effectively, and most importantly, how those ideas can be put into practice. We're featuring presentations from Ella McCarthy, co-founder of SciBurst and former communications specialist at Australian National University, Dr. Will Grant, associate professor at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, and Dr. Isabel Freiling, assistant professor of communications at the University of Utah and responsible AI fellow. They'll discuss why understanding your audience is one of the most important parts of science communication, how researchers define and think about audiences, and how today's online world, from social media algorithms to AI-generated content, is changing the way people discover, understand, and trust science. Tune in next week for part 2 with Shelley Wunder-Smith, Director of Research Communications at Georgia Tech, joining the panel for a discussion of practical strategies based on the research presentations. You'll hear a lively discussion about best practices for communicating science in today's ever-changing landscape. Now let's start with Ella McCarthy to share insights from her research paper titled, What Are We Talking About When We're Talking About the Audience?
Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. And hello, everyone from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Australia. You're joining us today to talk about audience, which is one of my favorite topics ever. So I'm super excited to talk you through some audience research that Will Grant and I did between 2022 and 2023, culminating in this beautiful paper published in 2024. Now, this work spiraled out of my undergraduate degree into a one-year honors project where I was solely focused on this research. And the goal was really to understand what even audience means when we're talking about it in science communication, research, and education contexts. So I thought I'd start off with some of my favorite quotes that we have early on in the paper. This beautiful one by Sue Stocklemeyer's 2001 paper that science communicators who think only of the message and not of the audience are likely to fail. I think this frames our conversation today really well. And this is also a beautiful one from Fanrek et al. From 2023, saying if audiences don't pay attention to something, it kind of doesn't exist. So in the wonderful world of science communication, whether you've been here for a long time or a short time, I'm sure all of us have heard the phrase, know your audience. And for me, as a young science communication researcher and practitioner, I really struggled to know my audience because I couldn't conceptualize all the different components of audience I had to pay attention to. And this kind of came down to, and it was really summarized by this quote from the Routledge Handbook of Public Communication of Science and Technology, edited by Bucci and Trench, where they talk about how audience conceptions in SciComm are often underdefined and remain implicit rather than explicit, but also that these conceptions vary considerably. And this is something I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to understand all the different ways that we do conceive of audience in the science communication landscape. So we did a study to understand that. And this is the paper we're talking about. I'm going to run through it today. So if you haven't had time to read it before this presentation, don't worry, I'll give you the highlights tour. This paper, what are we talking about when we are talking about the audience, is a piece of work I'm really, really proud of. And here is kind of a summary of the audience concepts and the categories we came to discover while reading through over 1,300 science communication papers across 5 major science communication journals. And on the very far left, you'll see these 3 overarching conceptual categories, and they are being, doing, and qualifiers. So the being category includes demographic, knowledge, embodied, and values-based audience conceptions. And these are ways of thinking about the audience that involve the audience themselves. Whereas doing, which involves interaction and dynamic-based audience groups or conceptions, is qualified based on things an audience is doing. And interestingly, qualifiers is a group of audience concepts that modify the being and the doing categories. So on the far right, I've kind of got some examples to explain these categories a bit more. I won't go into all of them because this is just a bit of a recap of this research, but I thought I'd touch on one of the most interesting ones, which is in the doing category. And this is about dynamic audiences. And for me, this is one of the most interesting audience conceptions we have. And this is where science communicators consider their audience as changing and co-creating meaning alongside and as part of the science communication activities that are occurring. So thinking of your audience as really dynamic and actively changing and participating in that science communication. So with that in mind, let's talk about how frequent these categories are, because across all the papers, we start to see some really interesting patterns emerge. And we see in this chart the number of articles each of these categories appeared in, and also the proportion as a percentage. So I've highlighted the top and the bottom most popular audience concept categories. And it might be really interesting to us all in our science communication roles to consider that for science communication research, at least in across these 5 journals that we looked at papers through, interaction-based audience conceptions were the most popular. So most science communicators in these research papers we looked at, they were conceiving of their audience as interacting with their science communication work. So that number is 76%. That's just over 3/4 of all papers were considering their audience under this conception. And that's far more than categories such as demographic, which would include conceptions such as location, age, gender, etc. So I think that's really interesting, and it might be not what you've thought of as to be the most popular category. And we can also see the least popular category is future or potential audiences. So that's considering an audience that may not even exist yet. So that one, on the other hand, I think it makes sense as to why we might not be conceiving that as frequently. And this, for me, was a really good guide of how we're thinking about audience in science communication research so far. But our research goes even further than this, and as well as looking at over 1,000 different papers, we also surveyed tertiary educators in the science communication realm. So I pulled out some standout statistics from this work for you all. 95% of educators of science communication teach audience in their classes. So that is a very, very high statistic, and something that I personally, as an audience fan, love to hear. We see that 74% of educators agree that audience is very relevant to their teaching, with the remaining 26% of educators saying that it was relevant. So they're up there in the highest 2 categories given for that question. And interestingly, 65% of educators really stressed the plurality of audiences. And this was a theme that comes up in our research again and again, is how multivalent and plural audience conceptions seem to be in science communication. Lots of science communication researchers and educators are thinking of their audience in terms of plurality and multivalency. Super interesting. Also, 22% of educators, which is quite low, consider a general audience framing. So that's quite small and is about half of how the papers consider general audience. So we start to see that trend smalling or becoming smaller across our educators. Now, if we go to our standout statistics from across the papers, this kind of goes back and confirms what Bucci and Trench were saying within those quotes that I started out with. Less than 4% of the papers we reviewed included a specific definition of either audience or their audience. So that says that over 95% of papers don't explicitly define their audience. And this kind of explains to me why understanding audience was something I was really struggling with, because it was often implicit rather than explicit in these science communication works. Another huge statistic to come out of this was that almost 84% of papers included a conception of audience in more than one category. So we're really, really, when we're talking about audience, we're thinking of it in a multiple variety of ways. And that's really interesting to me. And also a fun little note, audience was mentioned over 8 times per paper on average. So definitely up there in that category. Now, I don't want to jump the gun too much because I know we're going to have a really lively discussion later on this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about applying these concepts. So these concepts are directly applicable to my own work as a science communication practitioner as well as researcher. So Cyburst, my science and popular culture business startup, which also includes a podcast, we are really audience focused, and we use lots of these different categories that were conceptualized and spoken about during this research to best understand our audience and how to pitch to these people through a podcast platform. And this concept has also been really helpful through my work as a communication specialist at the Australian National University, where I was communicating cutting edge research coming out of the university. Now, you will notice that I recently left the Australian National University and I'm going on an adventure to the UK. So if anyone on this call, this is me pitching to my audience, all of you, if you know of any amazing science communication work happening in the UK that you think I should be a part of, please let me know. So that's all for now. I'll jump in more to these concepts later. And again, this work was done by myself and my supervisor and co-author Will Grant.
Thank you so much, Ella. That was very, very helpful and interesting. And I like your tie-in about actually how you consider your audience and who your audience is. It would be great to hear more about that in Cyburst. Maybe we can move on to Will Grant, if you can talk more about your paper with Ella McCarthy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much to all of the Newswise crew for bringing us into this. As Jessica said before, my name is Will Grant. I'm an associate professor in science communication at the Australian National University. And as Ella was, I'm also speaking from Ngunnawal land here in Canberra, Australia. I'm so glad to be here to be part of this event because I wanted to echo some of the things that Ella just said before. Audience is a fascinating concept in science communication, and it's something that we have weaved into all of our teaching in our center for the decades that we've been running. Some of the most common things that we will say to our fellow educators, to the scientists that we work with, to the students that come into our room is, first of all, if we are thinking about communicating our science, who is the audience and what is our goal? Now, so often when we think about audience, we take it as a simple concept, as something that, okay, we just understand what we mean by audience straight away. We understand it's the people that we hope to reach, the people that might be listening. But I think it's so fascinating here, as Ella has just shown, that actually the concept of audience is not simple. It's quite a rich concept. There are so many different ways that we can understand the audiences that we work with. And I think the powerful point that Ella has just made there is that we don't all have one way of thinking about the audience. Yes, it might be the people that are reading our magazine, listening to our podcast in our classroom. But actually, there are many different ways that we can drill into that and understand how does facts about them, things that are inherent to them, who they are as people, or what they're trying to achieve or what they're doing, change that. And I think it's a really important thing to start being explicit about these things. I imagine as we work with many science communicators, public information officers, and people in roles, that they probably have a robust idea of the audience that they are working with. And perhaps they do define them as they work with those different groups of people. But I think there's a lot of things that we can do more as educators in the science communication space to equip people with richer ways of understanding what it is that people are thinking about. And so I just want to explore a little bit more some of the points that Ella just raised before. One of the ones that jumped out for me, for example, is that some of those conceptions of audience as who they are, they're being conceptions. So demographic, um, knowledge, values, and embodied concepts are actually quite low in the ways that the science communication research literature has explored. Just 25% of the definitions are looking at demographic sorts of ways of understanding our audience. Now, you would think that's amongst the most common things that people would do. You know, I'm talking to older people, younger people, I'm talking to people who speak this language or something like that. But in fact, not not the bulk. Only 25% of papers actually defining the audience that they're working with in these terms. I think that jumps out to me as something quite strange. Probably most of you as working communicators probably have a definition straight away. You would be thinking, okay, I want to reach older people, or I want to reach younger people, or people who speak that language. So it suggests to me perhaps we're not being explicit when we're doing research on science communication in defining these things, or perhaps in our communication work, we are taking something a little bit implicit there. The other one that really jumped out to me is that really low number of papers that defined audience in terms of values. I think Ella had the slide up before, and it was just 4% of papers actually attempted to define the audience they are working with in terms of what they care about. Now, I think that's a really interesting fact, because if I am working on a science communication project, of course, I want to know what an audience already knows. I want to know if they're a high school level audience, or if they're a university educated audience in that topic. But I actually think, what do they care about? You know, what do they want to achieve in their lives is actually a really important thing for science communication. And if we think, some of the most important places that science communication happens. So, for example, in the doctor's office, or in a public health communication setting, knowing what people are trying to achieve is actually a very important thing that we might work our communication around. So I think my final point that I'd like to conclude with is that many of us think about audience all the time. But our hope is that we can make that a richer concept, something that we can define in a multitude of different ways, and we can be explicit in how we talk about that concept, so that when we are doing both our communication and then thinking about our communication as something that we can share with other communicators, a research sense, that we can define that concept much more clearly to each other, and then understand, okay, what might we do better next time?
Thank you, Will. Thank you. That is great. And Isabel, if you can share more about your recent research.
That was published, I think, about a year ago in PNAS, where we talked about how our information environments for science look like. And that paper also covers how hard it is for academic researchers to do research in those environments, like social media. Also applies to AI, of course, because we typically don't have access to all the data that we would need to really know like how the audience is engaging with the content. But I'll leave that part out and focus more in my presentation here on how our current information environments look like and what that means for effective science communication. So from the research that we do have, where we have some access to data, even if it's not perfect and we don't have like the teeny tiny data that we would like sometimes, but it's still giving us some good information about current information environments. So let's get started with how people use information. And this picture here that I had AI generate for me visualizes really nicely how we are using different devices at the same time. You can see the woman here watching a movie while being on her laptop and also scrolling on her phone. And if that's not enough devices, you can see her iPad is right next to her. So there's very limited attention that we pay to the content that's in front of us. And of course, this picture also shows us how multimodal we are interacting with content, right? It's not only that we see the website on our laptop or desktop PC anymore, but we might also use it in a mobile context. And then our information environments are, of course, optimized for engagement because platforms, not only social media, also search, they want us to see relevant content that we are likely to engage with, to keep us on their platforms. On social media, for example, that's how they make their money. With our attention, they can then sell ads. And if we're looking at what content keeps us engaged, what means not only that you are maybe hitting the like button or sharing the content, but also that you're actually paying attention to the post, the video, etc. It aligns with our interests, and that connects very nicely to paper from Ella and Will, have the being category of values, right? So if it aligns with our interests, we're more likely to pay attention because then it seems more relevant to us. Other research shows that content that creates moral outrage is also getting more attention, or content that uses moral and emotional language, negative and critical content. But of course, that's not necessarily always how we as science communicators might want to present our content. So we're struggling with that because we're competing with content that is optimized like that. And maybe that's not how we would want to like to see our scientific content. And if we're looking at some other things we're competing with, this is a video from Greenpeace's deep sea mining protest that basically gets lots of visual attention through how it's designed with like the sign. You can now see it flying in with the robot arm. Listen to science. We are competing with advocacy groups that have lots of funding as compared to maybe some of our settings to create those communications. We're competing with celebrity scientists. Here we have an example from Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he has a really attention-grabbing photo and then a little caption, but sometimes we have a little bit more information and maybe not as nice of a visualization that gets the attention. And it's also not always super precise and correct what celebrity scientists do. As we can see here, where Neil deGrasse Tyson is conflating climate with weather, and a climate scientist is then trying to clear that up because that's already a widespread confusion, and they would like this not to spread even further. And we're competing with scientists' Substacks. Here is an example on public health from Caitlin Jetelina. We are competing with scientists on podcasts and sometimes making misleading claims there about COVID. And all of these are produced, curated, and amplified on online platforms. And of course, we are competing with AI-generated content. Here, I asked Gemini to just produce me some science topic post. And it gave me this photo, and I was like, what is this even? So give me a caption. And then it gave me a caption, and together with the photo, it would probably look really nice, but the photo is supposed to visualize bioluminescence, but it's clearly AI generated. It looks like a photo though, so it's also misleading in that way. And when I asked ChatGPT to create something for a social media post for me, it gave me this. And I think ChatGPT looked more at my research, and that's why I created this. But what I like in combination with the Gemini creation is the picture 5 that you can see here. AI can make claims look credible. And that is also what we're competing with. And then we do have limited control over content, which connects again to Ella's and Will's paper and the doing category they had with the subcategory dynamic, where the audience is changing the meaning of our content sometimes. So here is a post by Professor Peter Hotez, and he is trying to respond to vaccine misinformation in the post and on the podcast there. And then Joe Rogan is responding and making it about, hey, debate with me. And then other celebrities are jumping in. You'll see a post from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. also talking about the debate. Elon Musk also commented on that. I just didn't put that in the screenshot here as well. And so the conversation shifted the issue from how should a scientist respond to vaccine misinformation to why won't this scientist debate? And so there can be some recontextualization or transformation of content. But of course, also content can spill over from one platform to another, where maybe in that one platform it was intended like this and it made sense, but in the other platform it might work differently. And then we have the blurring of professional and personal speech from scientists as communicators also, where sometimes they voice their personal opinion on issues, and sometimes that's also merged with their job as a scientist. This is a social media post on this from Blue Sky, but this also happens in academic journals where here Jacqueline Gill is talking about being a scientist and her abortion and how that connects. And if we look back at the being category of values from Ella's paper, and then think about how the audience might react to that, people who have similar values might be like, oh, great, I totally agree with Jacqueline Gill or with Michael Mann, so I trust them and what they communicate. But people who don't agree with them, who have different values, might see then also their science as biased. And so that's an issue that we can run into there. And so how does this all matter for effective science communication? I would say we need to balance attention and how algorithms prioritize content with accuracy and credibility. So, of course, we also want to get our audience's attention. And as I just presented, that's not that easy because it's not anymore that you sit in front of a newspaper and just read that, or sit in front of cable news and just watch that. But you're competing with like all the other content that's out there right now. And so we still want to get the attention, but we also still want to be accurate and credible. And we need to consider potential backlashes that can happen when certain posts are transformed by others and then get a different meaning. When we're voicing our values, how that can influence trust that people with other values might have in us. And when we're correcting others, that can also be backlashes, especially when the science is still uncertain. We've seen that with COVID a lot, where we have communicated so early on about COVID that the science was still uncertain, and then later on it turned out to be wrong. And if you use that for a correction, though, people again might perceive you as biased or trust you less. And so that's the struggles we deal with in current information environments. And with that, I thank you and look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you so much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.